A lot has been made, I think, and rightly so, of the importance of background knowledge in reading. Certain studies, such as Recht and Leslie's 1988 baseball study, I mean, I think this was certainly the first time I encountered this idea, have become touchstones for those who want to highlight the value of background knowledge. Your paper suggests that there's some nuance here, in particular relating to the way that background knowledge can compensate for weaker word recognition capabilities. Could you unpack this idea for us?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the Recht and Leslie paper is referred to a lot. You're right. It's the baseball study. It's the number one, the go-to study for a lot of people, and it's a really nice paper that suggests that background knowledge can help compensate for generally poor reading skill, and they have accomplished that by asking children who have high or low knowledge of baseball to read a passage about events in a baseball game, and then they are asked to recall the elements of that story and to order events in the story in terms of their importance to the game. And the methodology was based on a series of studies by other researchers in the late 70s and Chiesi and Boston team that were looking into a similar idea. But the great little element that they've added is comparing that background knowledge to their starting reading comprehension and being able to measure across the two. I think that paper has been brought forward, and rightly so, as an indicator that background knowledge is a really important part of our reading comprehension. However, sometimes I think it's been misinterpreted in different places, perhaps by suggesting that increased background knowledge on a topic can completely ameliorate poor reading skill. That if I have a poor reader in my class, then all I need is a diet of more background knowledge, and that will fix them as a strategy. I've also seen it being used to say that, well, once students have pretty good decoding skills, then reading comprehension really is just teaching them more stuff about the world, and that's it. So almost like this idea that it's just world knowledge plus decoding, and that equals reading comprehension. And really that doesn't necessarily square with the rest of the research that came into this particular paper. So there are a couple of observations that we made when we were putting together this critical review. First of all, that the text and the content of what you're reading really matters. The outcomes from this particular study, where the less skilled readers and the more skilled readers actually had similar performance on this particular task, it's been replicated, but really it's replicated in really specific situations where you have a limited field of knowledge. Typically it's in a game like soccer or baseball. It's really goal oriented. So there's a clear, the actors within that particular story, there's a clear thing that they're trying to achieve at any particular time. So when we look at studies that move to texts of different genres or that require a wider knowledge base about the world, the level of compensation background knowledge tends to drop off a little bit. We don't see the same effects where a stronger background knowledge means that your less skilled readers are indistinguishable from your more skilled readers. Instead, you see some effect of the background knowledge, but there's still a difference, a statistically significant difference in the understanding between more and less skilled readers. Probably I'd say that it's important to note that the level of compensation depends on how you're measuring reading comprehension. So you tend to see those really large effects of background knowledge on assessments that are looking for a student's recall of events. So really that are plumbing the text-based understanding rather than the situation model. So once you move to questions that are asking students to make inferences about the text from what they're reading, then you tend to find that those compensatory effects of background knowledge start to drop away a little bit. And I think that when we discuss this paper, we probably need to acknowledge a little bit more of some of those limitations, and that hard and fast idea that it's all background knowledge once they good decoders doesn't necessarily hold, and that genre actually matters. So you just need to have a little more variety in your instruction and think intentionally about how you apportion your instruction time, because that's a valuable thing for us as teachers.
I would say for me, probably the most interesting part of the study. And I know, actually, I mean, you ask me on a different day, I'll probably pick a different bit because it is something I've read a number of times. But the most interesting part of the study for me is what you describe, I think, as a reverse cohesion effect. Something that you suggest is potentially a version of the expertise reversal effect from cognitive load theory. What do we mean by the expertise reversal effect, and what is this reverse cohesion effect, and how do they kind of connect together?
Yeah, so as you say, the expertise reversal effect comes from cognitive load theory from Sweller and his various colleagues, and it really just describes situations where the relative effectiveness of learning conditions changes depending on the expertise of the learner. So often that's discussed in terms of when you have a learner who has low mastery, a novice of a particular idea, often explicit instruction, large levels of modelling and rehearsal, a guided practice is a really useful thing for developing their expertise. However, there comes a tipping point in their expertise when that explicit instruction is no longer as effective as the learner's moving into a different mode of learning. So it might be looking at non-routine problems in order to build their understanding and see a range of different applications. What you might see is more guided inquiry type instruction. So the reversal is basically what's good for the novice learners suddenly is much less effective for those learners who are more expert. And we thought that we saw something a little bit similar with the reverse cohesion effect that was coined, I think, by Daniel McNamara in the 90s, where when we're considering the text, every text has this property that's cohesion, and cohesion is the degree to which a text is easily read, and that the words and phrases and sentences and paragraphs work together in a logical sequence that's easy for a reader to follow. Right? So high cohesion texts are generally easier for readers to unpack. There are less difficulties. You need to make fewer inferences as you're reading, because it's giving you cues for the relationships between different ideas. A less cohesive text is often more difficult. It's asking you to draw on your background knowledge far more often. It's got fewer signposts as to how one idea relates to the next. So the reverse cohesion effect, it's describing the ways in which learners or readers who have different levels of knowledge gain from texts of different levels of cohesion. And really the quick way to say it is, if you've got children or any reader who has a low knowledge base for a particular topic, they learn more from a high cohesion text, right? It's beneficial for them to have a text that's easy to read, where the connections are laid out for them, that they don't have to draw on their perhaps non-existent prior knowledge to be able to make sense of the text. And Kieran, you pointed to this before with your reading of the text that you've been reading recently. It was the same for me with some of the work that I did as part of this study. Is you open up a book and you quickly realise after 3 pages that the level of cohesion is so low to my background knowledge that I just can't make any sense of it. So I need something that's more cohesive. So these low knowledge readers, they learn more from these high cohesion texts. But the interesting thing is, and where you get this reversal idea, is that for high knowledge readers, they actually learn more and benefit more from low cohesion texts. So the text understanding for those readers who have high knowledge is actually improved if you can force them or induce them to make more inferences, and those inferences are successful. So if you've got somebody who knows a lot about sharks, for example, you want them to learn more about sharks, then it's actually beneficial for them to encounter text that's a low cohesion text. They have to infer and keep drawing down their knowledge of sharks from their long-term memory to make these inferences. They're having a high success rate in those inferences, so they're able to maintain a really strong and rich and accurate understanding of the text. They're going to learn a lot more from that cognitive work that they are embarking on than perhaps if you gave them a low cohesion text where it wasn't required for them to bring in this knowledge from their long-term memory because it's already explicit, it's spelt out in the text. So in the critical review, we talked about this Goldilocks effect where we've got to find that point for the kids in a class where the text is at a level that's effortful enough that they have to really think carefully about what it is that they're reading and draw in any of the background knowledge that they do have, but it's not so effortful that the inferences they're making are incorrect or that they can't engage with the text, or the act of reading and making sense of the text is so effortful that there's none of that cognitive space remaining for them to actually transport some of those ideas and encode it back into working memory. And I think it's a really interesting idea for us as teachers when we're thinking about the texts we choose for our students in our classes and the scaffolding and support that we provide for our kids while we're reading those texts.
Alongside this idea of the expertise reversal effect, what this immediately brought to mind is the general idea of like desirable difficulties, because in effect what we're doing here, well, as far as at least this is my interpretation of it, is, you know, if a kid doesn't have a great deal of background knowledge, they need all the help they can get to make something from the text. And these cohesive devices like consequently, and as we said in the first sentence, or subheadings that say what's about to happen or what's just happened or whatever it might be, all of these cohesive ties, really helpful for them to just get any kind of sense from the text. Whereas if you've got loads of this background knowledge, you already know quite a lot about the thing that you're reading, you need something to keep you awake. You know, you need to be nudged to find this difficult in order to recall, because I presume this is being measured on, you know, through pupils' recall after the event. In order to remember what you've learned from this text, you need to be forced to reread stuff and to actually go, oh, hang on a minute, what did that say? You can't go through it on autopilot. So yeah, I mean, I think this has wider implications for teaching reading, certainly. I love this idea of the Goldilocks zone of texts where you're saying I want them to understand it, but I don't want it to be easy. As soon as it becomes easy, they won't be learning from the text in the way that I want them to, particularly, as we say, if they already know some stuff about the text. So yeah, I was that is, as I said, the most fascinating part of the text community, and the one that made me start thinking about the texts that I use. I guess one of the challenges, and I might, if I can ask you a separate question on this, is that obviously I presume a lot of this stuff is done with pupils reading text independently. And so these effects are often about, you read this text and I want to see what you can make from it. Whereas in the classroom, we're doing something slightly different, whereby we're hopefully intentionally pitching the text above where pupils can make sense of it on their own, and then using our expertise as teachers, our knowledge of the text to scaffold it, because, that makes sense. We don't just want them reading stuff that they can make sense of purely on their own. So do you think that these findings are most applicable to us thinking about the kind of independent reading we give to kids? Or do you think there are wider things we can take away for that more scaffolded classroom instruction?
Primarily, we would apply them to students with their independent reading. Probably what I wouldn't want people to think is that for a class that I need to come up with 24 versions of the same text that the students are going to read, or we're going to get into groups where I group students by their background knowledge to read particular texts. So really, my first part of the answer would be primarily for individual reading. However, it also feeds into some of that classroom instruction, because as a teacher, when we're working with a complex text, we're making judgment calls all the time about the levels of scaffolding support that we give prior to reading the text, while reading the text, and then following it up, and then how we can adjust the levels of scaffolding we provide for different students that we have in our care. And I know that some teachers have found some success in having just a slight version of text, particularly for non-fiction text, where they might provide some more subheadings. It might be a diagram that accompanies it for some of the students, just to sit as a scaffold and support to help them navigate the text without it being a case of having 6 different versions of text. So I think it does have implications for the way that we teach both the whole class level of instruction, but also in terms of the texts that we select for our kids to engage with.
I think what I love about this paper in particular is the way it orients the whoever's reading it to a kind of quite productive way to think about how we support pupils. And this links to kind of what you've just been saying there, because there's often a temptation to say, oh, okay, these are my weaker readers, and so I need to do this to accommodate for them. Whereas when we start thinking about background knowledge and the impacts that has, we're starting to perhaps think, oh, well, actually, I know that these pupils have certain knowledge about the contents of this text already, and so this might be more appropriate. Or actually, this text is on a subject that I know my pupils know very little about, so what I'm going to have to do is X, Y, and Z. So rather than just thinking about, stronger readers or weaker readers, etc., we start to think about that interaction between the pupil and the text. It isn't just, are they capable readers or not? It's what's their capability like with reference to this specific text. And that's something I'm always banging on about, this idea of, a pupil's ability to comprehend is often specific to the contents of the text rather than text more generally. So yeah, another reason to recommend this text is that it has this orientation that I mentioned.
I've also got a tangent, because as I'm listening, I'm thinking it might be about the distinction between the expertise reversal and the reverse cohesion effect. The residue that I've got from my reading about that from a long time ago is that expertise, that level of expertise, probably comes in around A level in England. So I'm thinking 17 years old, 18 years old. When you've mastered a subject to that level, that's probably when that kind of thing helps. But with the reverse cohesion effect, I'm imagining 7 and 8-year-olds. Have I misinterpreted the research? And is that possibly the distinction between the two?
Well, I guess it's the question of domain size that we're thinking about in terms of the knowledge, that you can have younger readers who have a sufficient domain knowledge to be able to make sense of a text and start to work with texts that are a little bit more complex. And I think that going back to some of the things you were talking about earlier, Chris, in terms of the kids who are coming into your classroom with the high levels of knowledge around particular topics, one of the powers of having a knowledge-rich and coherent curriculum is that you can actually set things up so that you can help students develop a strong knowledge base in a particular area. You select a text a little bit further down the line that the kids have had the opportunity to learn about the context of that text, and so you can actually pick and select texts that are more difficult than maybe you choose for your class when that's a little bit less known. And I think there are age limitations in terms of how complex or how low the cohesion is. So I guess that when we're talking about that effect, that curve will look a little bit different for younger students compared to older students. But I think that if we think about cohesion as the relative levels of cohesion to text that are aimed at particular ages of students, then I think that we'd see a reverse cohesion effect for texts that are lower cohesion for relative to the age of particular students. So you're going to find it really difficult to have students even with high levels of background knowledge to parse texts that are deliberately difficult to read. It's just a much more difficult thing for them to be able to do. You are going to be able to introduce texts that are not deliberately simple, where they start to use some fewer cohesive ties, and the kids are going to have to make more inferences. So I guess when I talk about that change in the effect, that's the cohesion really is age relative to some degree.
Our focus is going to be on spelling. I think it's fair to say, Lynn, that you think that the English writing system is often introduced to pupils in ways that can lead to spelling difficulties. Is that right or fair? And can you elaborate on this for listeners?
Yeah, I had to think about that. It's not so much as introduced. I think the English writing system, in a scheme where people have a high quality phonics scope and sequence, the introduction to the English writing system with a phonics scope and sequence is an absolutely brilliant way to introduce the writing system. I think what more I'm driving at is that sometimes, even though we get off to that fantastic start with phonics, it then gets kind of abandoned. The English writing system and the other layers are not just phoneme grapheme correspondences, tend to get abandoned because, well, look, here's my hypothesis as to why that abandonment might occur. You can probably think of a time or a region or a group or a system that didn't have phonics and was doing things like balanced literacy or analytic phonics. You know, let's just take some random words and apply some phoneme grapheme correspondences to that. There are times, and that still exist, those times and systems where phonics isn't being used. When people started using phonics, the results that they got, and systematic synthetic phonics as a result of the inquiries into the teaching of reading over the past 20 years in the Anglophone world, when they started to do that, the relief was palpable. It's like, oh, I'm getting results. I'm actually filling gaps. And I'm, you know, there's so many more children that are coming along for this ride of appropriate literacy development. So the relief is huge. And that, I think, has become the main focus, just get them reading. But actually, English is a complex orthography. So although it does consist of phoneme grapheme correspondences that are very reliable and quite easy and intuitive to teach with a good scope and sequence, there are other layers. And those other layers, I think, are neglected, especially if you just stay at the phoneme grapheme correspondence level. That is, any letter sequence must be a grapheme for a phoneme. And that's actually not true, not in an orthography like English. English has other layers. It has morphemic layers. It has etymological layers. You know, there are some letter sequences that are there because of the story of the word, not necessarily trying to correspond to sounds. There are things like orthographic expectancies as well. Even simple things like, you know, you don't use CK at the beginning of a word. That's an orthographic expectancy. And a good phonics program will tell you that. There are other expectancies, though. There are other things that are deeper. And if we keep trying to shoehorn phonemes and graphemes into one another, then what happens is children are forced to learn or try to learn, and unsuccessfully in a lot of cases, have these huge charts of this is a spelling for the sound blah, when actually there's a different thing going on with the formation of that word. And you can explicitly teach that too. So that's where that's what I mean. It's not being introduced and, you know, causing spelling errors. It's that the actual spelling, not the encoding of sounds, is abandoned or not taught or left to chance. And I think we can do better. So that's my position on that.
I entirely agree. And I think there's an extent, well, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to put this as a question because it's kind of my hypothesis on this, which is that I think that there has been like an overextension of what phonics is meant to do. So people basically think that there's this English is, not contains, but is full stop an alphabetic code. And that's all there is to it. And so our job is to teach phonics. Through teaching phonics, we're going to teach pupils the entirety of this code explicitly, and to not do that, even if in theory it were possible, is somehow negating our responsibilities as a teacher. We have to do this because if we're not introducing them to we're not introducing to all of orthography in the way that we should. When the reality is that phonics was never designed for that. Phonics was just designed to introduce pupils to the most common bits of the most common correspondences of that code, so they can learn the rest of it from real text experience. Does that sound roughly aligned with where you're coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I call it getting into the sweet zone. You know, if you look at David Scher's work on phonological recoding, for instance, and self-teaching, he talks about, and again, lots of other research has been built on that hypothesis and shown to be a very efficient, effective way to get children reading, blending and segmenting, attaching phonemes to graphemes and so on. It's a really, really important foundational step. You're absolutely right. And we want to get children very quickly to the sweet zone where they're self-teaching, where they have a sufficient phonological awareness. And again, a good phonics program is going to cover that and sort of extend that through phonics lessons. We want them to get to that sweet spot where they are able to recode, phonological recoding, and figure out possible likely pronunciations for unfamiliar words. It's such a great goal. But the other part of this is writing. And writing, again, has been shown, and spelling, writing by hand and so on, has been fairly convincingly shown to also help build lexicons, to build efficiency when it comes to recognition as well as recall of letter sequences. And when you start writing and when you start spelling, that's where the other layers come in. And the earlier and better you teach that alongside a good phonics program, the more efficient it is for a higher population of children. And I think we're totally agreed on that, Chris.
And I think this is probably where I think because the word encoding within a phonics program has got this correctly narrow definition of, oh, okay, right now we're writing down a word using a known set of grapheme phoneme correspondences. And the main reason we're doing that is to embed a pupil's understanding of decoding. Kind of makes sense to call that encoding. But if then that is thought of as, and that's what spelling is forever and ever, then yeah, it can be problematic. You mentioned David Sher. I think it's not surprising, or at least to my perspective, I don't think it's just surprising that people who perhaps push back on these ideas about the wider breadth of English orthography are often those who are very, very keen on the work of Diane McGuinness. Really brilliant reading researcher, made huge contributions to the field, but she was, in early reading instruction, someone who was very skeptical of what she called late stage sight word recognition, or Airy's work on orthographic mapping, which has seemingly a pretty robust body of evidence behind it now. So I think it isn't too surprising, perhaps, that those that push back on some of these ideas are those that are see a lot of her work as gospel. Just a random aside there.
Now, gospel and the endpoint. And look, Airy's work didn't just have a lot of backing and support and so on, and was well researched. Work from that took place. So further research was embedded, on top of that, to over and over again show with finer and finer detail how orthographic mapping can and doesn't happen, And so the work that Airy came up with, and Kilpatrick and Sher, they all worked together at some point, has been built upon, whereas I don't think McGuinness's work quite underwent that sort of evolution. It was just very convincingly stated and rested on some excellent principles, but it couldn't be taken, or wasn't particularly taken further in the way that Sher and Airy and Kilpatrick's work has been taken.
I mean, as I'm listening, I have recognized that certainly within the last 5 years, I've been a teacher who has held some of the misconceptions that arise from not really understanding this. Is this a rite of passage, and is the only solution to find out more about the process of reading and spelling and the learning process that happens? Or can we do anything as school leaders to support our colleagues who may be in a similar position?
Well, I don't know about only solution, but I would always say that in education, the more you know about your subject or subjects, especially if you're a primary teacher, boy, you've got to know a lot of stuff. You've got to do the maths as well, and so on. But the more you know about those subjects and how those systems work, the easier it's going to be for you to impart that beyond your Dunning-Kruger expertise, right, to people who you might not be able to conceptualize as struggling with this because it's so easy for you. And spelling it's a really good example of that. Yeah, you can get kids reading with some pretty poor instruction in phonics and some pretty low-level theories and understandings, but you can't get them spelling very well unless you make it a lifelong journey, I suppose, to understand how words work. And it is a lifelong journey. 10 years ago, I wrote the first edition of Spelling for Life, and a lot of the things, I've done the second edition now, and so many things have changed. I'm not ashamed of that. And I'm still learning, as time goes on. So it's not the only solution, but it's a very good one. And one that I would want people to draw on, and move to, because I do a lot of the things that I say are to do with what I see as casualties. So I do run a practice, and I have children who, for whatever reason, struggle to acquire literacy, and mostly it's spelling. Even if reading is something that's not particularly problematic for them, a lot of them come to us because they cannot write legibly, quickly, and accurately. And some of that has to do with balanced literacy, for sure. But the ones who can read, I'm seeing casualties of approaches that say every letter sequence is a sound.
You've got a lot more experience, perhaps, of these really struggling spellers, or from my teaching experience, they were fairly rare, but they did happen, where you'd have kids who were voracious readers who would score almost full marks on a comprehension assessment, but their spelling would be very poor indeed. And in almost all circumstances, not all, but almost all circumstances where I saw that fairly rare combination, the pupil in question often had issues relating to physical coordination. So handwriting was an issue. When I spoke to their parents, they occasionally said that actually there were just wider issues with gross and fine motor control. Is that a pattern you see at all, or am I, from a very limited data set, over-interpreting?
It's definitely a pattern, and that would be, in the sphere of dysgraphia. So dysgraphia is difficulty not just with the mechanics of writing, holding your pencil and forming letters and writing neatly and quickly, but also with the text generation, the output, the next word, the next sentence, the next paragraph. So we see a lot of dysgraphic students, absolutely, but also we do see dyslexic students who don't have any of the motor issues, and the dyslexic students, basically, they constitute a large majority of the students that we see. Those are students who I like to sort of term as, they have a potential. They have a potential that's for forming robust mental orthographic images. So putting words in their lexicon that they can easily, effortlessly recall. They have a very low ability to do that. They have a low potential. And no matter, how much you can explain the etymology and the morphemes and so on, you can move them towards their potential. But there are many cases of children where spelling is just kryptonite. It is just going to be the thing that breaks down when they're under pressure. And you've got adults in your life who are exactly like that. So forming those mental orthographic images for instant recall is in fact something that does exist on a spectrum of ability. And the more that we understand about how words are built and impart them, the better for them. But there will, no matter how good you are, there will be students who find it very, very difficult to spell as well. So it's not the same as reading. That's the other thing, that maybe the sort of McGuinness influenced cohorts might have as an idea that speaking and spelling are reverse processes, and they absolutely aren't. You can be a brilliant reader, a brilliant orator, and still find it incredibly hard to bring a word from your long-term memory accurately onto paper under pressure, no matter what. And they're different. They are different beasts. They're really different things. So again, the solution for me always is to try to move people towards their spelling potential, whatever that might be, and to understand that there are limits to that. And knowing how words work helps to push their potential, in my experience.
Very quickly, thinking about what you say and your knowledge of this area, and reflecting on Kieran's phrase, a rite of passage, it does stand out to me that you have started off from a position of understanding linguistics, and it's kind of a lot of people I know who are interested in reading research kind of do the opposite journey. So they start off with schools and then practicalities, and they're into reading research as a result of that. And the more and more they read of reading research, they find themselves going, hang on a minute, I need to know a bit about this linguistic stuff, be it learning about phonology, be it learning about English orthography more generally, learning about semantics and syntax and this sort of stuff. And that's kind of the journey that I'm on. I'm now currently wading through introductory textbooks and bits and pieces on linguistics. It's a very short way of saying I'm just really jealous that I studied chemistry at university and not something that actually would have been valuable and interesting like linguistics.
I'm sure chemistry organized your mind in ways that make you the thinker that you are, Chris.
I don't know about that, honestly. I do not know about that. Yeah, no, Kieran's had too many conversations with me to...
What principles guide your modeling, and do they change when modeling concepts and or processes?
Yeah, definitely. You don't mind if I consult my little notebook here, do you, Kieran, as a novice thinking to dap a guest? I've written down, first of all, clarity, being explicit, particularly for my colleague and I. We share a class. We teach a class together for half the week each, basically. We're working this year with a cohort who really appreciate explicitness and clarity and minimal use of teacher talk. And it's funny, you mentioned, Shannon, was it Andy Thorby you mentioned earlier? Because he is a co-author, I think, or he edited Making Every Maths Lesson Count, which I dipped into just before the show, actually. And it's got an absolutely brilliant chapter on modeling and explicit instruction. And it goes through some fantastic real life opportunities that you can, not opportunities, but strategies that you can put into practice in the classroom that really, really work. Everything from isolating the skill to the use of analogy and number lines. And it's got some brilliant stuff in there. But in terms of principles, just to get back to that, I would say clarity is first and foremost, explicitness, really careful use of images. And I know there's lots of research out there, isn't there, about dual coding and how images can be used. But we as teachers, I don't know if you guys are guilty of this, but I certainly in my teaching past used to hurl a huge amount of images at slides that weren't entirely helpful. And I've put thirdly, I've limited it to 3 really, was the really careful use of language and the sharing of an objective at the beginning of the lesson. So I think those would perhaps be my top 3. But again, it depends on what you're teaching. So if it's a mathematical, like a standard algorithm, I would use a different process compared to a concept like prime numbers.
I wish I had limited mine to 3. I really tried to get it to a nice little number where it could be kind of snappy, and I've ended up on 8. So my 8 kind of guiding principles, and some of them will be similar to yours, Jim. So the first one being take a step or 2 back before you take a step forward. A common mistake that I think some of us have made probably, in our earlier career kind of stage was that, you'd go, today's objective is this, therefore I will start with this. But I think, as you read more about how children learn and as you progress in your career, you understand that we really need to make that kind of explicit connection to prior knowledge and prior learning. So taking a step back and saying, this is what we've been doing, and then being able to move forward is a really important principle for me. The second one that I've written down is know your onions. And I know that sounds really silly because, of course, you should know what you're teaching. However, if we think about our job, it is a really tough job. We have to teach a number of subjects. And even as Jim, we're in a similar situation where I share a class for half a week as well. So I don't have to teach all the subjects. But certainly when I was a full-time class teacher, teaching maths and English every day, and then your science, your geography, your DT, your PE, your art, and so on, it's really hard to know everything about those subjects. However, if you're going to teach effectively, you really do need to know it. And that comes with time and with experience and kind of, if you look at kind of Lloyd's model where they give their teachers a day, a term for kind of planning ahead for that subject knowledge planning, you can do it, you can know it, but to really model something effectively, you have to know the ins and outs of it, the intricacies, the misconceptions that might get thrown up. because otherwise it won't be as effective as you need it to be. It's interesting you talked about kind of that kind of teacher talk aspect of it, and I know for a long time there's been a lot of talk about kind of minimizing teacher talk, and I prefer to say kind of optimizing teacher talk, so that you are very careful with your language, like you said, Jim. You know the words that you're using, you've prepared what you're going to say as much as you can do without it being kind of going into every hour of your evening or your weekend. But you know the explanation you're giving, and you know how to build on it, you know how to make it kind of hit home with the children. So it's not necessarily about talking less, but it's about making your words as effective as they can be. Another thing that I think is really important is breaking it down and breaking it down again. We think that it might be broken down into small steps, but it probably isn't. And you need to really think about how you can chunk it up for your kids, because they are newer to it and they're novices, and they really do need it in that kind of bite-size, kind of incremental progress. With that, I've sort of said never underestimate the need for more examples. Always have more up your sleeve than you think you're going to need. I know, part of my job involves watching teachers and giving feedback and coaching. And something I probably talk to most teachers about is the need for more examples. 3 examples probably isn't going to cut it. Have more ready, because there's going to be someone that doesn't quite have it, or a misconception will get thrown up that you weren't quite ready for. So you might have some on the slides, depending on how people work. I quite like to have things, under the visualizer, and I might have a kind of a sheet of paper to off the kind of camera to say, these are my examples that I would like to do in this order, or what misconception might get thrown up. And if it's something I've taught quite often, then I'll be able to do that without making notes. But certainly when I was a newer teacher, I'd need to make notes around different examples I was using, and being ready to kind of bring those in, because otherwise you get to empty, you've got nothing left in the tank, and you think, oh, I can't just come up with an example on the spot, because lots of teachers can't. And I guess that kind of goes with knowing your onions. Planning for that handover. I know Tom Sherrington talks about it a lot, that I do, we do, you do. It should be an extended handover. It shouldn't just be I do, you do, you do. It's a lot of back and forth. It's a lot of working together. That is the important bit. That's where the learning is going to happen, that kind of holding their hand through it. Make really small adjustments between examples. So making sure that kind of those deep structures are similar, but kind of changing surface level stuff, so that they're getting used to it. It's slightly different context, but really it's the same, so that they get that in that kind of repeated practice again and again. And then my last one is kind of beware the curse of knowledge. You are an expert as a teacher, but you have to make things really explicit. If you've decided to use a word, or you've put an apostrophe somewhere, or you've drawn a diagram in a certain way, tell them why, because it's not inherently clear to them, and they'll be better off for it. So those were my 8 guiding principles.
Nice. I mean, yeah, if we wanted to go for 11 ways to improve your modeling, I'm not sure how many people would stay with us, but I think they're fantastic. And you both mentioned talk, and I really like your reframing, Shannon, in terms of optimizing, because I mean, that's certainly the sense that I got, Jim, from your sort of explanation of it, was that that's essentially what you're trying to do. I call it be more Shakespeare, which is probably the worst way to describe it, because no one knows what that means, because apparently Shakespeare didn't waste a single word in any of his books, but I couldn't possibly tell you if that's true or not. What does that mean for your decision making when you're thinking about what you say? Because I've got an idea of what it means, but if anyone's listening, it probably makes sense to start with you, Jim. What can they do to consider how best to optimize their talk in the classroom during their explanations and their modeling in particular?
Okay, well, if I can just give a mention to, particularly concerning maths, the polysemous word, of which there are many in maths, that would be one thing to really sort of carefully curate. Like if you're asking pupils to draw at a table, it's it could be a dangerous question for some, unless there's that clarity. So I think one thing to consider would be just have in mind, know your onions, like you've said, Shannon. Know what the words mean. Perhaps delve into a little bit of their etymology. I know you've mentioned before, Kieran, I think, was it the division symbol that you talked about in terms of its history and looking like a sword and so on, is just to give those words that people might not be familiar with a bit of background and a bit of history. We're hardwired for narrative, so a bit of story there too. We use a lot in our school the sentence stem, which is a really powerful way of, I think, firstly presenting your information, allowing pupils to use it, and then that talk becomes hopefully internalized for them, so that over time they end up framing the sentences as you would like them to frame the sentences. And there are some brilliant ones out there. We use White Rose Maths as a scheme that provides some excellent sentence stems for us to use. So if I was to pick two, I'd go for polysemous words and just being really clear and focused about how you're using the words, and also sentence stems, providing a concrete model of how you want pupils to frame their talk. And I know you've mentioned as well, Shannon, about being really clear about providing examples and having lots and lots of examples. Can we also give a shout out to the non-concept, the sort of non-example? It's such a powerful tool. And I'm going to refer to the book again. It's Emma McRae's, isn't it? I think, Making Every Maths Lesson Count. There's a fantastic page of triangle examples, some really good outliers. And she argues that rather than providing a definition first, we provide examples first and really get to know those deeply before going anywhere near any sort of formal definition of, well, I've picked triangles because this is one of my favorite lessons, I think. Yeah, be aware of polysemous words and frame the talk for the pupils. Sentence stems are immensely powerful, and they also help to clarify a teacher's thinking about the objective too, because it makes you refocus on how you want pupils to actually talk about the subject that you're teaching.
On the division symbol, the etymology can be a dangerous thing. So I almost try and qualify my sources by, if this is going to be helpful to my pupils, then I'm going to buy into it. If I trust the source enough, because a lot of these things, lots of the mathematical terminology and symbols were sort of, it was 15th, 16th century clerics who were making these decisions based on older sources, if that makes sense. And some of the stories go way back, because I'm pretty sure at some point the division symbol was runic in nature, and it was almost like this Scandinavian dagger for cutting fish up into smaller pieces. But it's been so long since I read that I can't remember exactly who said that. So my judgment is, if this helps with my exposition, then I'm going to lean into it. Like, I think Zero's contested, but I even wrote about it in Thinking Deeply About Primary Mathematics, about the emptiness and the traders rubbing it into the sand and stuff. Now, Marcus de Sotoy was my source for that, but it may be that he was wrong. But I think it's really important, because if it aids exposition, then the 100% accuracy, it's not going to hurt people in the long run. So I think that makes a whole lot of sense.
I just wanted to add, I think the points about vocab and STEM sentences are really, really important. And I think so much of that comes from being prepared, which can be really hard when you're so busy and you've got so much to teach. But if you can take even just like 2 minutes before the start of the day and think about, what vocabulary must I pre-teach today? Because the value of pre-teaching that vocabulary before you start an explanation is, you can't underestimate it. Because I'm sure we've all done it, where we've been reading a book or we've been giving an explanation, and you say a word and you think, oh, I now need to explain that word. And that's stopping my explanation or stopping the flow of what I'm reading. And that's going to impact their kind of understanding of what I'm saying. I'm going to have to go back to back to the start so that they get it. I think it's so important to be prepared. And I think if you want to kind of optimize your explanation and that exposition, you need to know what words are going to come up, and you need to have, I'm not saying rehearse it constantly, but I do think it's important that you've planned what you're going to say. And that, again, that might sound stupid to some people, but there are definitely times where you're so time poor, or people feel like they have got too much to juggle, the planning of an explanation falls to the wayside, and that's like the most important part, is knowing your examples and your explanation to go with it, so that the children really do get it. And I also really just want to highlight again that kind of using those non-examples, using misconceptions as teaching points rather than letting them happen later, because you've missed a trick there. And again, you then have to go back, rather than saying, oh, you might be tempted to do this, or let's look at this, why is this not right? That sort of thing is really powerful, I think, when you're modelling.
I think Neil will be nodding along at the non-examples as well, especially the triangles, because he's been using that in our most recent talk when exploring sort of variation theory and direct instruction. Just as an aside, Shannon, you mentioned you noticed a lot of the same things in conversations you were having with teachers. Now, both of my books came from having similar conversations with lots of people over time. Are you writing these down somewhere? Because I would highly recommend it, because then the book will write itself for you.
I'm not writing them down. Perhaps after this, I will go and start keeping a diary of these conversations, because the these can come up again and again, and I just think, oh, let's do something with this. And actually, where I do think it's useful, I'm fortunate to work with a local ITT provider, and I do a few kind of training sessions for them each year, and I do a bit with our ECTs. And so I can say to them, this comes up, don't let this happen to you. But it's weird, as we were driving home from Winchester today, I was thinking about this episode and thinking, maybe there should be a little kind of guide for early career teachers or people further down the line even, and say, these are things that keep coming up again and again, and this is really important. Don't let this happen to you. Don't let this thing fall to the wayside, because it's crucial for children's understanding, which is, at the end of the day, why we're doing this job.
I'm looking forward to that book. I mean, someone really wise told me that when I started my last project, and now I think I'm hopefully going to interview her next week. There's a really excellent maths lead called Samantha, who is doing basically my job, but in the Northeast, with 3 schools in the Northeast. And I was able to go, look, here are all the mistakes I made, try and avoid doing what I did in 2017. So yeah, it might be even just be useful in that respect.